Is Carolina Warnerreed. I'm a sophomore at MIT, and we are so glad that you're able to join us here tonight. This is the final talk of a 6-part series that we've been doing on Tuesdays and Thursdays this month. Reason for God is hosted by Crew at MIT, which is a student group that I'm involved in. And if you're from another campus, it's really wonderful to have you here as well. Crew is a caring community where you can explore your faith or grow in faith, depending on where you are, if you're already a Christian. We host Reason for God in order to create a space where we can engage some of the big questions about life and about God. At these events, we really welcome people from a whole spectrum of beliefs, whether you're an atheist, a Christian, a member of another faith, whether you've had a lot of doubts, or whether you've been hurt by religion. Really, no matter where you are, this is a space where we can be honest about what we think and honest about our questions and doubts. It's also a place where we can disagree with what is said. All we ask is that we be respectful and polite to one another. So before I introduce our speaker, let me just tell you about a couple of things that will happen tonight. We'll have some Q&A after our speaker gives his talk, and in the panel on the right of your screen, you should be able to see 3 columns: chat, participants, and Q&A. And you can submit a question in the Q&A section and upvote questions so we know which ones are the most popular. So we'd really like to prioritize hearing questions from students tonight. Of course, feel free to submit questions regardless of whether you are a student or not. Just be considerate of the number of questions that you are submitting to make sure everyone has a chance. Please also look at the other questions before you post one to avoid duplicates, and just upvote the one that's similar to yours so we know which questions are the most popular. We would also kindly ask that you do not post comments in the chat section, since we're going to reserve that for announcements. So in previous years, if you've ever been to our events, you'll know that we usually serve dinner to everyone and eat together, but for obvious reasons, we're not doing that this year. Instead, we decided to be making donations for every single person who comes to this event to local nonprofits that provide food for those in need. So thank you so much for being here. It's really great that we have the opportunity to do that. After our first 5 talks, we were able to give $1,325 to a local food pantry in Boston. So that's really amazing. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Brandon Cleaver. Brandon is an itinerant speaker who has a passion for helping others consider the claims of the Christian faith. He graduated from Michigan State University with a major in journalism and a minor in sociology. He recently completed a master in Christian apologetics from Biola University and is currently working toward a Master of Divinity with a specialization in interdisciplinary studies at Moody Theological Seminary. Brandon enjoys speaking on topics such as slavery in the Bible, which is tonight's topic, culture and Christianity, ethics, urban issues, and various worldviews. He is active in serving his local community in Detroit through his church, and also serves with the inner city ministry of Crew in Detroit. Also, he currently serves on the Rochester University's Spiritual Formation Advisory Group. Throughout his career, he has worked as a sports reporter with the Des Moines Register, technical writer and technical implementation analyst with Thomson Reuters, and software engineer with Ford Motor Company. Brandon enjoys playing various sports and reading, but mostly spending time with his 2 sons, daughter, and wonderful wife. And a fun fact about Brandon is that he owns around 1,500 comic books, and his favorite show of all time is Little House on the Prairie. So it is my pleasure to welcome Brandon Cleaver to the virtual stage.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Carolina. They probably could have did without that last fun fact, but nevertheless, I'm sure they enjoyed it. Good evening, everyone. So glad to be here with you tonight. Let me actually go ahead and share my screen. Okay, can you see me okay there? Just making sure. Okay, great. Again, thank you all so much for having me out tonight. I would love to be there with you in person, but I'm just thankful that we have this virtual opportunity as well. As Carolina mentioned, I do get a chance to serve with Inner City Crew in Detroit. So, and I've done that for, I think, the past 3 or 4 years. So Crew has a special place in my heart. And this event in particular, I'm just so humbled to be here. I've had some friends and colleagues who have participated in it the last couple years, and they've spoken so highly of their experience and of the Q&A time in particular. So really, I'm just so grateful that you would take some time and hear a couple of my thoughts tonight. And I really look forward to our time in discussion and Q&A. Now, as Carolina mentioned, today I want to talk to you about a subject that a lot of people have wrestled with. Perhaps it's something that you've thought about a bit, or perhaps you've been in conversation with someone and not know how to answer some of these questions. And of course, this is issues around the topic of slavery in the Bible, specifically answering the question, does the Bible condone slavery? Now, what's interesting about this question and this subject is that typically when this issue is broached, there's this conflation or this connection that's being made between slavery in the Bible and pre-Civil War slavery. So to help out in our discussion today, what I want to do is sort of take us inside the hearts and minds of some notable slaves during the antebellum period. And that's just a period also known as the pre-Civil War time right here in America, to get their thoughts on this issue. How did those who were enslaved, think about this issue of slavery in the Bible? And again, specifically this question of does the Bible condone slavery? Now, again, obviously, the question of whether the Bible supports slavery was incredibly important to the enslaved Africans because they were habitually read certain portions of the Bible to reinforce their enslavement. In fact, there's one former slave, his name is James Pennington, and he went on to become a pastor, an author, and several other vocations. But he wrote this in his slave narrative. And you'll hear me mention slave narratives several times throughout this talk. If you've never read a slave narrative, I want to really encourage you to maybe check out a couple. What I'm finding in my discussions with people is that they have sort of a idea of what slavery entailed, but you get a whole different perspective when you read it from directly from those who were enslaved themselves. But anyway, this gentleman, James Pennington, he said this in his slave narrative. He said, "Is the word of God silent on this greatest of curses? I, for one, desire to know. My repentance, my faith, my hope, my love, and my perseverance all turn upon this one point. If the word of God does sanction slavery, I want another book, another repentance, another faith, another hope." You see, friends, the slaves' trust in the God of the Bible hinged on this question concerning slavery in the Bible. For them and for us today, this cuts straight to the heart of the moral aptitude of the God of the Holy Bible. Now, obviously, the answer to this question was and is critically important. So as we begin to dive into this subject today, I want to sort of frame the entire discussion around this one quote from another notable former enslaved African American. And perhaps at the end of it, you'll recognize this individual. He says, "I have in several instances spoken in such a tone and manner respecting religion as may possibly lead those unacquainted with my religious views to suppose me an opponent of all religion. What I have said respecting and against religion, I mean strictly to apply to the slave-holding religion of this land, and with no possible reference to Christianity proper. For between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference, so wide that to receive the one as good, pure, and holy is of necessity to reject the other as bad, corrupt, and wicked. To be the friend of one is of necessity to be the enemy of the other. I love the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ. I therefore hate the corrupt, slave-holding, women-whipping, cradle-plundering, partial, and hypocritical Christianity of this land." Now, these poignant and stirring words were uttered by Frederick Douglass. Now, this was a man who was intimately familiar with both the cast iron chains of slavery and the inexplicable feeling of freedom. You see, he recognized this sharp distinction between the Christianity of the American slaveholder, which was an ideology steeped in a racial hierarchy, and the Christianity of the Bible, which expressed a sense of liberation and equality for all peoples. But you see, not everyone agrees with these distinctions here. Many people read the word slave in the Bible and read its associated passages and understandably envision the slavery that took place early on in the birth of this nation. For example, listen to these words of the famous atheist Sam Harris, and this comes from his book, The Moral Landscape. He said, in assessing the moral wisdom of the Bible, it is useful to consider moral questions that have been solved to everyone's satisfaction. Consider the question of slavery. The entire civilized world now agrees that slavery is an abomination. What moral instructions do we get from the God of Abraham on this subject? Consult the Bible, and you will discover that the creator of the universe clearly expects us to keep slaves. Clearly, he says. Now, as with many questions concerning the Bible, the responses are multifaceted due to the nature of whatever subject it is. Now, in particular, with the subject of slavery in the Bible, or the issue of slavery in general, there's a critically important emotional and historical element that for some people undergirds the questions that they have. Perhaps it's some of the reasons why some of you came today to listen to this talk. Or for others, it may strictly be about some alleged textual issues or a supposed inconsistency in the character of God. Now, to begin addressing this issue, we want to do our best to understand what was actually meant by slavery to the writers of the Old Testament, since that's typically where the bulk of the objections derive. Now, to do this, having the proper context is paramount to this discussion. Now, in our 21st century minds, we automatically envision the kind of racially based slavery that Douglas here described. This slavery was marked by the transatlantic slave trade, in which Africans were kidnapped, families ripped apart, women brutally and habitually raped, men and women worked and beaten mercilessly. All this and many, many more horrific things that I could enumerate for you were done under this notion that Africans or people of African descent were subhuman and therefore could be treated like chattel, or in other words, as in mere property. Consider this description from the book, The Slave Community. Taken on board ship, the naked Africans were shackled together on bare wooden boards in the hold and packed so tightly that they could not sit upright. During the dreaded Middle Passage, a trip of anywhere from 3 weeks to 3 months, the foul and poisonous air of the hold, extreme heat, men lying for hours in their own defecation with blood and mucus covering the floor, caused a great deal of sickness. Mortality from undernourishment and disease was about 16%. The first few weeks of the trip was the most traumatic experience for the Africans. A number of them went insane, and many became so despondent that they gave up their will to live. Often they committed suicide by drowning or refusing food or medicine rather than accept their enslavement. Now, please hear me here. I included this description not to sensationalize things or to gross you out in any way. And trust me, there's much, like I mentioned before, there's many worse things that I can tell you about slavery in the American context. But I tell you this because, again, like I mentioned before, oftentimes when I'm in conversations with people, they don't really understand the torture that was inherent in pre-Civil War slavery. And it's important, particularly for our discussion, as we, again, juxtapose what's described in the Bible to what happened in antebellum, in the antebellum South. But again, in the Bible, slavery was quite different. In fact, many scholars agree that the Hebrew word ebed, E-B-E-D, or is sometimes rendered eved, E-V-E-V-E-D, that is often translated as slavery, is more reasonably translated as servant, particularly given our modern day sensibilities. In some cases, according to the Old Testament scholar Christopher Wright, it's actually a term denoting a high office that's applied to royal servants. Now, to see the difference, let's quickly look at a couple of different aspects of slavery, or rather servanthood, in the Bible, and juxtapose it with 17th century antebellum slavery. So there, as we go on here, I want you to think of this in terms of two main pillars. That'll maybe help you after the talk to remember some of the main points here. The first main pillar that we're going to come to here is motivation. The motivation was vastly different. Antebellum slavery was again predicated off the idea that Africans were subhuman and could be treated like property. Moreover, they were involuntarily forced into slavery, usually through kidnapping. Now, this practice was prohibited in the Bible, as shown in, for example, Exodus chapter 21, verse 16, which states, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him shall be put to death." So we see that the stealing of a human being is so serious in the Bible that it's actually punishable by death. In the Bible, though, slavery, or rather servanthood, was often motivated out of an economic necessity. Therefore, it was voluntary. Those who would incur debts for various reasons would actually sell themselves into slavery to pay off their debts. And this will be akin to what we know as indentured servitude. Now, I want to be clear, I'm not drawing an exact parallel between the two, but as I'm trying to help us to think through what this would look like, it is somewhat akin to indentured servitude. Now, furthermore, during the pre-Civil War times, during the pre-Civil War involuntary slavery, slaves were typically never set free. And this also was the case for their offspring. They would both be subjected to lifelong slavery. But again, juxtaposing this against the Bible, Hebrew slaves or servants were to be released after 6 years. So it was more of a contractual agreement. For example, you see in Exodus chapter 21, verse 2, when you buy a Hebrew slave, he shall serve 6 years, and in the seventh, he shall go out for free, for nothing. And then hear me here. Even when this person, as stated in this verse here, is released, listen to what happens as described in Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 14. This is God speaking to the Israelites. You must supply them generously from your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you must give to them. So here we see an extension of care and compassion, even in this regulation that you simply would not see present in antebellum slavery. Moreover, remember that this person likely became a slave out of economic necessity. So furnishing this person with some capital actually encouraged economic independence. As Gary North observed in his book, he said this short-term indentured servitude was designed to produce long-term independence. Now, it's important to note, though, that there were different levels of regulation and limitation that were given to non-Hebrew slaves. For the sake of time, I can't go into those right now, but I do invite your questions on that later. However, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact, and this is very important, that the Bible still takes time to outline standards of proper treatment of foreign slaves. In an ancient Near East culture, even the mention of a difference in regulations for foreign slaves meant that the Bible was actually providing a clear safeguard against the mistreatment of people, regardless of their race, ethnicity, or religion. So what we see here, friends, is the building blocks for universal human rights. Now, the second pillar that we have here is treatment. What about the treatment of slaves? Now, in the pre-Civil War slavery, again, slaves were regarded as chattel or mere property, and they were treated as such. They were stripped naked for examination, males, females, and children, and sold like animals on auction blocks. They had heavy iron chains strapped to their ankles and wrists and necks to prevent them from escaping. Slaves, again, were mercilessly whipped for any and everything. Women slaves were mercilessly raped. And what former slave Harriet Jacobs, what she detailed in her slave narrative, she called this the most intimate form of humiliation. And slaves were maimed and murdered without any consequence to their master. But in the Bible, we find a revolutionary concept. You see, here, slaves were actually to be treated as people with dignity and not mere property, unlike slavery in other cultures of that time period. So, for example, we see in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 53 through 54, it says, "He shall treat him as a worker hired year by year. He shall not rule ruthlessly over him in your sight. And if he is not redeemed by these means, then he and his children with him shall be released in the year of Jubilee." And another example we see in Exodus chapter 21, verse 20, that if a master actually harms his slave or rather servant to the point of death, he is also to be put to death. And later on in that very same chapter, we see that there are other types of harm that's described that would result in the release of one slave. Now, earlier I talked about how this was sort of revolutionary in the ancient Near East culture in general. And for example, I'm sure many of you have heard of Babylon and perhaps Babylon's Hammurabi Code. So for example, if we're thinking about this issue and we look at another ancient Near East culture, consider this Hammurabi Code. You see here, it stated that the laws were actually based on one's social status. So it stands to reason that slaves would be on the lowest rungs of society. And in their cases, harm was not restricted, it was actually promoted. And this includes physical harm, such as rape and mutilation. And the Hammurabi Code is something that you could easily Google and read through the code, and you'll see what I mean. I don't want to detail some of the things that they talk about in there, but it gets pretty graphic. But even though many times the tension of understanding slavery in the Bible is within some Old Testament texts, there's also much debate that circulates around some New Testament texts. See, Howard Thurman wrote a book called Jesus and the Disinherited. Great book. And in this book, he argued that at the crux of Jesus's religion was his concern and his care for the less fortunate. And in it, he details his conversation that he had with his grandmother, a former slave, Nancy Ambrose, in which she recalled some painful memories in which the words of the New Testament writer Paul was used as reinforcement for her enslavement. And here's that conversation that they had. She said, during the days of slavery, the master's minister would occasionally hold services for the slaves. At least 4 or 5 times a year, he used as a text, "Slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters. I promise my maker that if I ever learned to read and if freedom ever came, I would not read that part of the Bible." The psychological effects of the oppressive, racially based antebellum slavery was no doubt pervasive. And here we see a tense relationship with some of Paul's words. Now let me back up and explain a bit about the Bible for those who may not be aware. The Bible has a bunch of letters written to various churches in the beginning of Christianity. Many of those letters were written by Paul in order to teach, encourage, correct, rebuke, etc., etc. Now, one of these letters has some pretty significant implications for today's talk, because we have a letter that was written by one of the leaders of the Christian movement, Paul, to a slave owner about a slave. And this letter is called Philemon. Now, the letter to Philemon is very, very short. You can read it probably in about 5 or 10 minutes. But I think, again, it holds some significant value for truly understanding Paul's thoughts on this matter. So for context, Paul writes this letter to Philemon, again, a slave owner, on behalf of his slave, Onesimus. Now, Paul writes the letter from jail, but he had a previous encounter with Onesimus, in which Onesimus actually became a Christian. So Paul is writing this letter to Philemon, who is also a Christian, to receive Onesimus back as a brother and not simply as a slave. Now, this letter here was actually used by pre-Civil War pro-slavery advocates as leverage for their cause. You see, Philemon actually became a representative for the modern day Christian slave owner, and it was used as political propaganda and motivation in such cases as the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850, which actually mandated that all escaped slaves be returned to their masters. Now, the argument is sometimes made that since Paul didn't explicitly condemn slavery and demand Onesimus's freedom, he therefore must be pro-slavery. Well, I think this is false for at least three reasons. Number one, not speaking out explicitly against something doesn't necessarily mean that you are for it. Number two, if you pay close attention to the language that Paul uses throughout the letter, he is overtly establishing this bond of familial love, or a type of family love, between Philemon and Onesimus. He uses words like son and father and brother, all during his pleas to Philemon. And this is language that you would simply never find used to characterize a relationship between a slave and a master during the pre-Civil War slavery. And finally, three, although Paul doesn't plainly and maybe explicitly rebuke slavery in this letter, he implicitly denounces it through his appeals. You see, Paul made it clear that he could have asserted his authority with Philemon, but he did not think the best way was through coercion. Here's Paul's words. He says, therefore, although in Christ I could be bold and order you to do what you ought to do, yet I prefer to appeal to you on the basis of love. You see, love is not truly love when it's forced. And Paul had a bigger goal in mind, and that was the transformation of Philemon's heart. And the transformation of his heart and the heart of other slave owners would actually cause a system like slavery to crumble. Dr. Eric Mason explains why Paul first goes for Philemon's heart instead of first rebuking the actual system of slavery by saying it's because the heart is where the system is created and upheld. But let me be crystal clear. Even though I've sort of elucidated some profound differences between slavery in the Bible and antebellum slavery, the slavery that's described in the Bible was not ideal at all. This was not God's plan from the beginning. These laws were actually put in place because of the hardness, what the Bible calls the hardness of men's hearts, which just means our stubbornness. And many of the bad decisions that actually produce situations of economic hardships. It's similar to how divorce seemed to be permissible in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament, Jesus actually explains that the reason for that was because of the hardness of men's hearts. But he goes on to clarify that this is not how it was from the beginning. So in some ways, God initiated or instituted these measures of grace in a way to mitigate our imperfections. And in other words, as Dr. Esau McCauley once stated, the regulations put forth to govern slavery in the Bible was God's attempt to mitigate the impact of human sin. And of course, sin being the breaking of God's moral law. But despite the hardness in the hearts of the slave owners, interestingly, many slaves, again like Douglas, recognized quite a difference. You see, there's this notion among some that slaves merely adopted the religion of their masters because this is what was forced upon them. And this isn't true for a number of reasons, but just one in particular. If you even did a cursory reading of slave narratives or Negro spirituals, it would prove this point. For example, there's one Negro spiritual entitled Slavery Chain, and it was written in 1865. And it says, slavery chained and broke at last, broke at last, broke at last. Slavery chained and broke at last. Going to praise God till I die. Way down in that valley, praying on my knees, told God about my troubles and to help me if you please. I did know my Jesus heard me because the Spirit spoke to me. He said, rise, my child, your children and you shall be set free. I done pit in one mighty captain for to marshal all my hosts and to lead my bleeding ones to me, and not one shall be lost. Slavery chained and broke at last, broke at last, broke at last. Slavery chained and broke at last. I'm going to praise God till I die. Now, interestingly, this spiritual, again, was written in 1865. And this was the same year that slavery was legally ended by the ratification of the 13th Amendment. For 246 years, Africans were kidnapped, thrust into brutal, dehumanizing slavery, and was told by their captors that the Bible foretold of their current predicament. But many of the slaves didn't buy that. You see, they came to know a God who the psalmist said was close to the brokenhearted and saved those whose spirits was crushed. A God who cared about justice and freed the Israelites from the bondage of the Egyptians. A God filled with compassion who literally wept at man's misery. A God who chose an enslaved people to be his people, and a God who wasn't aloof but could intimately understand their sufferings because his son, Jesus, suffered a great deal as well. Now, I'm probably going to show my age a bit here. And if we were in person, or if I could sort of see your faces right now, I would ask you, do you know what this is? Now, some of you may be in college, I think right now, maybe at MIT schools. So you may not be familiar with this. Now, for me, a kid growing up in the 80s, this was like my virtual reality, okay? It's called a Viewmaster. Now, if you aren't familiar with it, again, it's this handheld sort of red device, and it's like binoculars that you put up to your eyes. So you would insert these thin cardboard discs that you see here, and these cardboard discs held images. Now, if you tried to look at these images outside of what they were made for, the images themselves would look quite peculiar. But when you viewed them through the Viewmaster in their proper context, everything came into focus, and the image quite beautiful. And you see, friends, this is what it was sort of like for many of the enslaved Africans. You see, they were told this one story, this perverse and peculiar story of this God who actually condoned their enslavement. But as they learned to read and experience him for themselves, the true God of the Bible, as Douglas said in the beginning, the pure, peaceable, and impartial Christianity of Christ came into focus. So let me ask you a question. What picture of Jesus do you have right now? You see, we often have this misconception about Christianity that is just another religion of a bunch of do's and don'ts and a bunch of rules to follow and what not to do and what to do. And most, we often have this misconception, but that couldn't actually be further from the truth. Most, if not all, of world religions say, if you obey, then you will be accepted. But what we find in the Bible is actually totally opposite. Here, Jesus Christ says that you are accepted. And since we're accepted, we actually choose. We choose to obey him. We don't have to do anything to earn his love. And perhaps through this talk, through the other talks, over the past few weeks, the true Jesus is starting to come into focus for you. And if so, the kind folks from Crew, MIT, Chris Swanson, and everyone, myself, maybe some of the other speakers would love to invest some time and talk to you more about who Jesus is and to help you understand Christianity more. But suppose you're still questioning who he is. You wouldn't be alone, because Jesus actually asked some of his followers the same question. You see, they were taking a stroll in a village, and Jesus asked them two questions. The first question he asked was, who do people say that I am? And they gave some of the more popular answers around town. And then he asked them a second question. He said, but who do you say that I am? And one of his followers, Peter, turned to him and said, you are the Christ. You see, Jesus had revealed enough about himself so that they could understand truly who he was. And those same revelations apply to us today. You see, through his own words about himself, saying things like, I and the Father are one, and using phrases like Son of Man, all attested to someone with divine authority. His actions of healing and forgiving sins, something that only God could do, and his fulfilled prophecy that he would die and rise from the dead, again, all attested to who he really was. My friend Abdu Murray, he's one of the, also an itinerant speaker. He has this great saying that I think is apropos for a talk like this. He says, if a thing's value is determined by what someone will pay for it, then the cross of Christ reveals that each of us, every one of you on this call today, is immeasurably valuable to God. And this is the ultimate challenge to past and present questions about equal value and dignity of all of humanity, regardless of race or any other differences we may possess. Jesus Christ sacrificed his life to bring justice for all. Thank you so much for taking the time to hear this talk today. Again, I don't know if I thanked Crew MIT at the beginning. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to our Q&A time together. So I'll come out of presenter mode and talk with you guys some more. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brandon, for that talk. That was just a really great breakdown just of the sheer brutality of slavery in America and how that contrasts entirely, not only with depictions of slavery in the Bible, but also what God and Jesus says about equality between people of all races. So thank you so much for that. We're now going to be moving into a time of Q&A. And I'm going to be reading the questions from the Q&A section in descending order of upvotes. So everyone, please just take a moment to type in your questions and upvote your favorite ones, and also add new ones as we go along. And as a reminder, please look at the questions before submitting yours so that we don't have any duplicates, and just vote on the question that's most similar, or that is similar to yours. And yeah, definitely upvote questions so that we know which ones are the top ones that we're going to answer. We do not, oh yeah, here we go. Okay, perfect. So I will ask the first question. Much of the slave population in America were African POWs, prisoners of war, sold to foreign buyers by their captors. Per Deuteronomy 20:10-15, POW slavery is permitted. Per Leviticus 25:44-46, lifetime slavery of foreigners is okay. Why?
Okay, I'm sorry. Let me read this one again because there's a couple elements to it.
Yeah, definitely a lot of different direct passage references. So thank you for that question, Sohan.
Yeah, and this is Sohan, is it? Okay, thank you so much for this question, Sohan. Let me just read it back here. Much of slave population in America were African POWs sold to foreign buyers by their captors. I think for those who aren't familiar with Sohan, maybe what he may be referencing here is, I think he's talking about the African slaves that many, they were POWs over in Africa. That's true to a certain extent. There were a lot of them, but there are other circumstances. I won't go into that right now, but that is true to a certain extent. Per Deuteronomy, sorry, kind of moved on me here. Okay, per Deuteronomy 20:10 verses 10 through 15, POW slavery is permitted. Per Leviticus 25:44 through 46, lifetime slavery of foreigners is okay. Why? Okay, so the challenge, I was talking to Chris about this. One of the challenging parts of a discussion like this is that some of the discussion takes on a longer discussion. So maybe the first one here, because I would have to go look at those specific. It's a number of verses there, so I would need to look at that and talk to you more about that. Maybe we can talk a little bit more offline about that one in particular, because I can't recall it. I'm sorry. There are literally dozens dozens of Bible verses, but I would love to talk to you more about that. I'm not avoiding it at all. I just can't recall it off the top of my mind. But the second one here, I think I actually mentioned that one in my talk, but you said that per Leviticus, lifetime slavery of foreigners is okay. Why? Yeah, so the lifetime slavery part is they can do that. They do have the right to do that because it was different. Again, remember in the talk when I talked about when I looked at Hebrew slavery. Okay, Hebrew slavery was almost always again predicated off of for these economic reasons. Again, out of this economic necessity. But as Sohan pointed out here, this verse would actually pertain to non-Hebrews, so it would be the foreigners. So there were some different rules and regulations. So oftentimes the circumstances with which one became a slave and as a foreigner was quite different. They could be a POW or a number of other things. And during that time, if you were a POW, you would essentially be destitute if you were left to your own devices in a foreign land. Now, sorry, I'm just looking back at one part of the question here. So the important thing to remember is that a couple things. Number one, the culture was vastly different, vastly different. Slavery was rampant everywhere. So again, God didn't condone these things, but he put forth regulations for them. And we actually see as we go throughout the Bible, particularly in the New Testament, that it gets talked about more and more as something that should not be done. But the groundwork we have to consider for understanding some of these passages is what God has actually said right from the beginning. The moral foundation for slavery, for Israelites to consider slavery, particularly for foreigners, was actually born out of a compassion of their memory of Egypt. So, for example, in I can't remember if it's in Deuteronomy or Exodus, but God says explicitly, you can easily look it up. He says, "Do not oppress an alien." And why does he say that? He says, "For you yourselves know how it feels to be an alien, for you were aliens in Egypt." He says this over and over and over in different contexts. So he's constantly telling them to treat them with dignity and respect. Moreover, there were other aspects to foreign slavery, again, that was quite different. Again, I want to make clear, like I said near the end of my talk, that this wasn't idea and it wasn't God's original plan, but he did create some parameters around it so you could respect these foreigners. So for example, and you'll find in Exodus chapter 12, verses 44, that foreign slaves could actually become circumcised and partake in festivals such as Passover. This was strictly an Israelite again, festival. So for them to come into this, again, juxtaposing this with antebellum slavery, you would never see that the enslaved Africans were able to partake in the festivals or whatever celebrations of their American masters. Another one in Exodus chapter 20, I believe is verse 10, the foreign slaves could actually participate in the weekly Sabbath rest. In the book of Job, near the very end, in in chapter 31, Job talks about how he alludes to the fact that there may have been some legal avenues or some ways that I'm trying to think of the words that he uses, but some ways in which his bond servants or slaves could have brought some questions against him. Again, when we think about antebellum slavery, enslaved Africans, they had no way of bringing any type of grievances against their masters. And one more thing, there's a number of other things, but I want to make sure we get to some other questions. But there's one other thing that I do want to mention here. There's actually, I'm trying to remember the verse here, Sohan. If I can't remember it now, I'll probably remember it sometime, and maybe I can put it in the chat or the Q&A here, and you can look it up. But there was actually regulations for foreign slaves about becoming, they had the ability, if they wanted to become lifelong slaves, to choose to do that. Now, why does that matter? Because if we think about this, the fact that the Bible is calling this out, it means that the circumstances were not anywhere near parallel to the terrible circumstances that the enslaved Africans and African Americans encountered during the antebellum times. This particular Bible verse, again, I can't remember the verse in particular, but you can Google it. It says something about if they want to stay with you for a lifetime, they can choose to do that, and you would pierce their ear with an awl, and then they would again stay with you as servants. And we have to remember, again, like I talked about, we hear the word slave and we automatically envision one thing, but the Hebrew word abad or avad is actually servant, and the Greek word in the New Testament, doulos, is actually more rendered bondservant. So if you do get a chance to read the book of Philemon, read it with bondservant instead of slave, and maybe you'll think about it a little differently. I hope that answered some of your questions, and I really mean it. I'd love to follow up with you on the Deuteronomy. So thanks so much for your question.
Yeah, thank you, Brandon, for that very descriptive answer, and also to Sohan for the very descriptive question. So one question that I think sort of underlies a lot of the questions I'm seeing in the chat is just sort of summarized in this question here, but it's the idea that antebellum American slavery is a pretty low bar. So like even if compared to antebellum slavery, the slavery mentioned in the Bible isn't that bad, it's still definitely not ideal. And so the question is, or it doesn't seem like an ideal picture of humans being equal. So I guess the question is sort of, how would you respond to that? Like, yeah, essentially, like, do you think that's still biblical?
Okay, so if I, let me say it back to you and see if I understand what you're asking. The antebellum pre-Civil War slavery is sort of the worst of the worst slavery. And so to compare it to the Bible is kind of we kind of see the vast difference between the two, because it's such okay. So that's essentially the question.
Yeah, the question is like evaluating the depiction of slavery on its own, not in comparison to antebellum slavery. It still is problematic in a lot of ways. So how would you sort of address that depiction?
Oh yes, okay, yeah. No, I appreciate that question. So so let me say, for example, first off, why I even choose to do it this way. It's because this is the question, this is the comparison that always comes up. People are always comparing it to it, and whether we sometimes subconsciously, and I get this all the time in Q&As, we may not think that's what's in the back of our mind, but it is. And really, I would actually challenge that a bit to say that antebellum slavery, it was definitely horrible. But if you look at Roman slavery, particularly some of the slavery that's sometimes, if you're familiar with like the what's the old movie, Ben-Hur or something like that, the type of slavery that went on during those times, it was analogous because they treated their slaves again as mere property, not like human beings. So I would say that again, pre-Civil War slavery was particularly bad, but there were other forms of slavery throughout human time that was pretty bad as well. So that's the reason why I do that comparison. That's the first part of the question. The second part here is just evaluating, if I understand you right, Carolina, just evaluating slavery in the Bible itself on its own head. Now, again, we keep using the word slavery, and I'm probably going to sound like a broken record. I'm going to keep reminding us, though, that if you look at again, we're reading the English text, okay? But if you're looking at it in the original languages and understanding it in that proper context, it's going to look quite different. So we put ourselves back in that culture, okay? This was a culture that was rampant with slavery. And so just like the example that I gave of Babylon's Hammurabi Code, we may have been disgusted. We should have all been disgusted by just the brief mention that I made of that harm, again, was not only restricted, harm was actually promoted. This was a moral good to do harm to those in the lowest social status. So even the regulations that the Israelites were putting forth in the ancient Near East culture was vastly radical to anything going on here. What God was trying to do was cultivate a society and a way of seeing things that was vastly different. If you remember early on in the Bible, I believe it's in Exodus, where he says that I'm going to take you. He's talking about the Israelites. I'm paraphrasing here. I'm going to take you, and I'm going to change you or make you so that you're a light to other nations, so that others will see you and desire me. They'll see something vastly different with the way that you treat others, with the way that you treat each others, with the way that you worship God and things like this. So he was slowly taking steps to show a different outlook than what these other societies had been used to. So that's why, again, I said at the very end that this was not, I want to say it as explicitly as possible. This is not idea in no way, shape, or form. And I'm not saying that the questioner is alluding to this, but I do want to make it clear that in no way, shape, or form am I saying that this was a good thing at all. It was not a good thing. It was a bad thing that God, in his grace, put parameters around, just like divorce. We know from if you're a Christian, an atheist, or whatever worldview that one may hold, I think we can all agree for the most part, generally speaking, that divorce usually has a lot of negative consequences associated with it. Now, of course, that there are outliers, like when rampant abuse is happening or stuff like that. But I'm talking about generally speaking. And this is why that God said it was such a bad thing. But because of the imperfections of humans, God put parameters around divorce. That's what I mentioned, when Jesus said that this is not how it was from the very beginning. So anyway, I hope that answers the questions. I'm sorry I can go on and on, but I'm trying to answer in detail and look at the time here. So
no, yeah, thank you. That was great. That was just I think that was an underlying question that was coming up with a lot of these questions that are making like specific references. For example, one of them says Exodus 21:21 indicates that a slave can be beaten as long as they don't die within 2 days. And then Exodus 21:26-27 permits manumission as sole compensation for blinding a slave in one eye. And do you consider this acceptable? I think your answer sort of covered that a bit, but if you want to elaborate a bit more on that.
Yeah. Well, we'll see if there's something different. If not, we can. I'd be happy to come back to it, or we can go for an extended time with some tables and maybe dig deeper into some of these. So
yeah. So switching to the subject matter a little bit, the top question right now is how did slaves in America come to a better understanding and more correct view of the Christian message when many of them couldn't read and were being taught a distorted version of the Bible?
Yeah, that's a great question. And okay, it was submitted anonymously. Thank you, Mr. or Mrs. Anonymous. So I'd just like to say that thank the person, whoever submitted the question. Um, yeah, so there's a lot of different. I've read several slave narratives like Frederick Douglass. Some of the ones I've mentioned, Harriet Jacobs, um, Olado Equiano. These are ones again that I would highly recommend that you check out. They're very, very good. Many of them um, actually learn to read in various kinds of ways. And they learned to read enough to where they could see that what was being taught was not actually what the Bible had to say. Some of it was through word of mouth that they talked about with other enslaved Africans that perhaps learned to read, because sometimes there would be some masters, or particularly the wives of masters, who would teach them how to read. So there was one other thing I wanted to mention. Forgive me, it leaves me right now. But those were some of the main ways in which they learned to read. Yeah. I mean, they learned to get a correct view of the Christian message.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I think the question also sort of just asks not only about the reading, but sort of like once, I guess, that slaves were able to read, sort of how what parts of the Bible sort of spoke against the parts that they were being shown that seemed to justify slavery, sort of how they came to arrive at a different conclusion reading the passages of the Bible than the conclusion that I guess they were being really given before they were able to read it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I'll give you one quick example. In what I read from Howard Thurman's, what his grandmother talked about Paul, for example, where she said, I'll just remind everyone real quick, where she says, slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters. I'm sure all of us have heard that verse before. It appears in two sort of different ways, one in Ephesians and one, I believe, in Colossians. Now, if you read it in Ephesians again, it says, slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters. And actually, a couple other verses right after that, it goes to, it further sort of supplants that idea of, again, being obedient to your master. And you're like, wow, how can you read this any other way? But the important thing about reading in the Bible is the same way that you would read any other text. So, Carolina, when you read my bio at the beginning, you talked about how I was a journalist at one point, and I would write sports columns of different kind, 18 inches, bigger feature stories of 60 inches or whatever. Now, if you jumped right to the middle of my story and read a couple of lines, oftentimes you would take it completely different than what I intended, because it wasn't read in the proper context. And the same thing goes for the Bible. Oftentimes, people will take one or two verses that sound incredibly horrible, but not read what's actually going on in the full context, perhaps in that book or in the surrounding verses of that particular verse. So again, here we have Ephesians, slaves, be obedient to them that are your masters. If you keep reading, go only a few verses later, you'll see it says, and masters, I'm trying to think of exactly how it says it, but something like masters, that they're not to inflict any harm upon their slaves, for their master is also your master, talking about God. And so even though that verse is speaking to the fact that though there are different roles that exist, for example, at Crew, MIT, I'm sure you have different people in different positions. You probably have like maybe a president or some type of leader of some sort, and then you have others that work under her or him. That doesn't mean that those that work under her or him are less valuable in any way. They just serve a different role. So that's what this verse, that set of verses, is talking about. God is saying, look, you're objectively speaking, your master is both you guys have the same master, and that's me. So don't treat them any other way than as the Bible talks about in Genesis chapter 1 verse 27, where it says that everyone is created in the image of God, and that means that we're all created equally and with inherent worth, value, and dignity. So that's just one example of what they would have read. But interestingly, we think of apologetics. I'm sorry, Carolina, I'll say this one last thing.
This is great.
Okay. Interestingly, we think of apologetics, okay, Christian apologetics, the defense of communication of the Christian faith, as more of a modern day, maybe machination. But if you look back at some of these texts, you will see that many of the enslaved Africans, or many of the formerly enslaved Africans, when they're writing their slave narratives, they're writing apologetics manuals. They'll say, listen, you used to say this to me, but the Bible says this, and this is what it's talking about. And then you had other people like the Grimke sisters, Grimke. Sounds like you might be familiar. Yes, the Grimke sisters. These were two Caucasian ladies who were part of this bigger abolitionist guild. You probably heard of William Wilberforce before. The Grimke sisters, I mean, they were not at all holding back. If you read their works, they really took those in their culture that thought that owning people, that slavery was a moral right. They took them to task, and they used scripture to do so. So I can give so many other examples, but yeah, this is what they would often.
No, yeah, thank you so much for that answer. I think it's important because a lot of the questions in the chat are bringing up specific verses that seem to justify one act or another, but you could probably find just as many verses saying the exact opposite thing, and it's also really important to look at the entire picture, like you said. So thank you for that. Another question.
I mean, I'm sorry, I can say one thing.
Definitely.
You just keep making me think of things. So, like, even if you think of the very first mention. The very first mention of slavery in the Bible had to do with the curse of Canaan, and this was in a larger narrative dealing with Noah and some things that went on. I won't go into the whole description right now, but slavery then was looked at as, in the very first instance, as a bad thing, and then even before, when I mentioned Job again affirms the idea of equality, even though he states that he has these servants that work for him. Okay, we think of Job as just this book dealing with pain and suffering and all the things that and it is that, but it also contains these other jewels that if we aren't careful, we'll miss those. So Job, I think it might be in verse 31. He affirms the same idea that I just talked about in Ephesians of equality, because he asks these two rhetorical questions. He says that did not he who created me in my mother's womb also create them? And if you look at the context, right, the verses right before that, he's talking about his bond servants. So he's saying, like, look, we're the same. We were created by the same master. Again, we just have different roles. So,
no, great. Thank you so much for making those points. There are two more questions in here that I think are really great, so I'm going to ask them. But do you think Jesus saw color? Does the Bible emphasize that Christians should be colorblind or instead aware of race?
Yeah, this is a great question. I actually give a talk. I think I might have actually talked with Chris about this when we were thinking about what talk should I give. One of the talks I give, I have a whole section on where I talk about what I call the colorblind motif. That's something that's very popular in our culture, and oftentimes people will reference Martin Luther King's speech, the "I Have a Dream" speech, and say, well, he said that it's not the context, it's not the um, how do you say it? The content, but the color. I can't remember. I'm sorry, I can't remember.
The color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Yes, there's a bunch of C's there, but but yeah, he says that, and so they'll, I think, misunderstand the point that he was trying to make. But yeah, sorry, let me scroll. Oh, it's right there. Okay. So anyway, to get back to the question, do you think Jesus saw color? If the question is asking, do I think he saw that there were people of different ethnicities? I do think so. I think in a larger picture, the Bible does. If you even look at some of the most boring parts of the Bible that people will say is where they have these long genealogies. You're just reading names. It seems like for a week. But really, I admit the first time I read it, maybe the first or second time I read it, was kind of boring. But as I started to think more about it, it's actually a number of things that are really important in these genealogies. And one, particularly to this question here, is that there were actually people of different ethnicities in Jesus's lineage. So, for example, you have Rahab, who was not of the same, again, ethnicity of him, and you have some other folks, particularly in the Old Testament, who were of different ethnicities. But does the Bible emphasize that Christians should be colorblind or instead aware? I think that God created us and everything about us uniquely, whether it's our skin tones, our eye colors, our whatever it is. And the interesting thing is that in the Bible, you see that people are actually able to use their cultural backgrounds. Like Paul, he says explicitly that I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews. He's proud of that. And he actually uses that, particularly given his former life of being a persecutor of Christians, in a way to connect with certain people. So as an African American growing up in Detroit, I'm intimately familiar with a lot of the questions and concerns that uniquely derive from the African American experience. And so oftentimes, so like a subject like this that maybe some of my other colleagues haven't studied quite as much because it's not a question that they get a lot. For me, because of my ethnicity and things like that, I'm able to speak into this in a way that perhaps some others aren't. And there's this quote. I'll say this and then I'll shut up on this question. But there's this quote by Dr. Beno van den Toren in his book Cross-Cultural Apologetics, and he says, "In the mirror of discovery of the strangeness of others, we ourselves also change." What's so important and striking about that quote, particularly in the context of this question, is that oftentimes, we see the other as strange or as weird, or what kind of cultural things are, but the way that we come together, the way that we learn more about each other is because we have these different cultural elements, and because of our different ethnicities, we bring different things to the table. For example, when I was a software engineer with Ford, I had a weekly Bible study with some women and men from Chennai, India. Only one of them was Christian. All the rest of them, I think it was about maybe 7 or 8, were all Hindus. They just wanted to learn more about the Bible. So we would get together again weekly and talk about it. We would talk about things and they would ask me to explain things. I would explain something, but I felt like it wasn't registering. I'm like, why is it not registering? It's because of my cultural background. So I would have side discussions with this other young lady who, again, was from India, but she was a Christian, and she would help me make that cultural connection between some things. So if I'm unaware, or if I'm not paying attention to the fact that they're of a different ethnicity, or if I'm putting my blinders on in a way to not see them, then I'm doing them a disservice when I'm trying to connect, with them. And also, I'll say this one last thing. Oftentimes, too, when we say that we're colorblind, again, although it's very well meaning, and I understand that a lot of people only mean it in a very endearing way, what you're often saying is that some of the experiences that many of us have encountered are because of our ethnicity, and that's been part and parcel of what has come to make us a whole person. I could give you a lot of examples right now that I've experienced, particularly when I was in Iowa. You probably don't know Iowa to be a heavily ethnic minority state. And I had a great experience there, but there were some things that happened as well, and here in Detroit as well, because of my ethnicity. My wife, for example, she's from Canada. She's white. She's French Canadian. There are certain things that have been said to us, and it's because of my ethnicity and her ethnicity. The beautiful thing, though, is that particularly in the book of James, James talks about the fact that God shows no partiality. That's the important thing, to not let these superficial differences be what separate us, but in fact, what serves as a catalyst to come together, to learn more, and to appreciate our differences. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you so much for that answer. That was a really wonderful response. I really think that you've done an amazing job discussing and answering all of these questions. We are unfortunately out of time, but I know that there's still some great questions in the chat, particularly this top one on the idea, is there profound spiritual justice in the Bible, or is it just material? That's a great question. So after this, we will have our speaker will be at a table immediately after this to continue the discussion with anyone who's interested. We'll just also have a discussion table with some crew staff and a faculty to discuss other questions that you might have. And you can also feel free to just stay in the room and hang at the table that you were at earlier with your friends. So we're always trying to improve the Reason for God series, and we'd love to have your feedback on tonight, as it is the last night. If you have not had the chance to fill out the Google form yet, we will have a link in the chat to that. And one thing we are offering for free are some really amazing books that are great for exploring some of the big questions about God and Christianity, and perhaps some questions that were raised tonight or on a different night, some things that our speakers have brought up. So if you'd like a copy, you can pick a book in the feedback form, and this is an offer for students only at this time. But some books that we're offering include The Reason for God by Tim Keller, after which this series is named, How to Be an Atheist, Why Many Skeptics Aren't Skeptical Enough, and Our Deepest Desires, How the Christian Story Fulfills Human Aspirations. So this was our final talk of the month, and thank you all so much for attending this event. If you've been coming all January, or if this was your first time, we really appreciate you joining us. And if you'd like to continue processing questions with us, we're planning on having some more smaller scale events during the year. So make sure you fill out that feedback form so we can connect with you if you'd be interested in that. Again, please join our table after we close this window if you want to stick around and continue discussing some great questions with Brandon and some other crew, faculty, and staff. And hope everyone has a great rest of your night. Thank you again. And thank you to Brandon.
Thank you so much.